We are almost there. Chapter 36 is coming, and here in chapters 34 through 36, we think about me verbs. Now, so far in elementary Greek, we have thought about verbs and their endings. So if we have verbs, and we have thought about the lexical form ending in omega, because the present active indicative first person singular is the lexical form, and if that omicron, that is the connecting vowel, has no ending, we have this lengthening to omega. The other type of verb that we have seen is that bit of irregularity with the deponent, it's often called, or the middle ending in my. We have seen some of those like erchomai, that's its lexical form. So we have truly a verb ending in my. Those again, those true middles, sometimes called a deponent, but the lexical form is my. Here we have our third lexical form ending, if you will, the me verb, where we have the me ending, mu iota, as in didwmi. So 1, 2, 3 types of endings for verbs, and all verbs will end in one of these 3 endings. And here in the last 3 chapters of the book, we think about these me verbs. Let's pray together. Lord, help students to grasp the me verbs, help them to remember principles of verbs from the indicative, and to build upon the principles we've seen already. Help them to fit this new knowledge that we gather in chapters 34 through 36 into what they already know. I ask in Christ's name, amen. So we think about me verbs, and we qualify them as irregular in the sense that they do not end in omega. And remember that omega is just the lengthened omicron, lengthened to omega, because the present active indicative first singular doesn't have an ending, so it lengthens to omega. And they're not the my endings for the deponent, so they're irregular. The me verbs. Now, these me verbs are characterized by some ideas that Mounce gathers into rules or principles, you might call them, and here's how they operate. We begin here by thinking about the present and the imperfect. These 2 tense stems, remember, are the continuous, they're imperfective, they're ongoing. So in both of these, we're going to have similar characteristics, and what is going to happen is we have a stem. We continue to remember that behind a stem is a root that is beneath the surface, under the ground, however you want to think about it. But we have our root, and then the particular tense stem pulls a root. And here, the root is just do, so it matches. There's an equal root and stem relationship. We have our stem, but what happens in both the present and the imperfect is a reduplication. Now, in the past, we've thought about reduplication as, yes, the perfect tense form. Well, here we have a similar principle, just the initial consonant, the delta, and the inclusion of an iota that gives us di. The omega, as we'll see in a moment, one of the future rules we're going to look at is that the stem vowel often lengthen, flatten out, and that's what we have here with omicron going to omega, and then the inclusion of me. So how we get from do to didwmi actually includes several of the rules we're going to look at here in the next few slides, but initially we want to think about the initial part of the word, and what we have is a reduplication in the present, and we can see in the imperfect that same reduplication, but the imperfect includes, that's right, that augment to still situate us in the past time. And here, once we start walking down the path of these me verbs, to talk about just one of these rules here, we're just talking about the first rule, we sort of begin to unfold the next several in how they work. We'll notice in a few slides that the aorist uses kappa alpha instead of the normal sigma alpha. The perfect continues to have a reduplication, but it's different than the present because the present we use an iota. and the perfect and epsilon. So we have these ways of connecting. We can think even here of the aorist and the imperfect. Both of these continue to have our augment. Both continue in that process, but we have the differentiation with the imperfect and the present, both continuous aspect, and therefore this initial reduplication. So the big picture here, we'll come back to these slides. Maybe you want to pause the screencast for just a moment, or even just reverse a couple of minutes here and watch this particular slide again to see how things are unpacked. Initially, we start with the beginning of the word, and with the present, there's a reduplication. That will cue us that we are in a me verb. The second rule, as Mounce calls them here, principles that we can see, is that me verbs do not ordinarily use a connecting or a thematic vowel. They are athematic. They don't include a vowel. So this vowel that we're looking at here, let me draw that line a little more clearly here. This omicron is not a connecting vowel. We have seen that connecting vowel pattern. Remember, O, E, E, O, E, O. But this is just the actual stem vowel. So the personal ending, and here's the point of rule 2, is added right to the stem. So men is added right to the stem. Omicron is not a connecting vowel. It is truly the stem vowel. Now we have 4 of these. Omicron that we're looking at here in chapter 34. And then in chapter 36, we're going to come back and look at alpha, epsilon, and upsilon. And what we'll notice is that the principles that guide us with omicron thematic conjugations also guide us in chapter 36. Again, we're going to build on what we know. Rule 3, we think about me verbs and personal endings in the present. We have some differences. Remember with the present, we have used what kind of endings? And this recalls us to indicative verbs. We've used primary endings. We have primary, and then we have the secondary endings, and the present uses primary endings. The future also uses primary endings. Remember, it's those secondary endings that clue us to some past time, the aorist and the imperfect. And so when we think about the primary endings, we remember there's no ending in the first singular, and then sementiensi, you remember that? Well, in the me verbs, we have 3 places where there are differences. One we know of already, it's me, and that's the first singular. But also here, the third singular and third plural. So instead of sementiensi, we have missi mentiasi. Missi mentiasi. So the me, and now we have the consistent use sigma and sigma, but then a differentiation here, osin, here, the did osin, and then in the first plural and second plural were exactly the same, but then we get to the third plural and we have did asin here. So first and third singular and third plural all are different in their endings. The third singular as well, the second person, this is the one I want. The second singular and first and second plural match what we would have with normal verbs, not the irregular me verbs. So a few differences. Now here's how we can simplify this. We already know the first singular because it's didwmi. The me verb gives it away. So all we have to think about here is the third singular here and the third plural. Well, the singular, in the singulars we'll see in a moment, the omicron lengthens to omega here all the way through. That's just another one of our rules that we're going to look at in a moment, but it happens just in the singular. In the plural, notice we have omicron here is the actual stem vowel, and osin just bumps up right against it with no contraction. And there are more letters here in the third plural than the third singular. So if we keep two principles in mind, we'll be able to distinguish between the third singular and the third plural. The first principle is in the singular, the omicron lengthens to omega. And the second principle is plurals are greater than singulars. And here we have more letters. That's one way to distinguish didocene here from didausin. And the latter idea of just singular and plural, there's nothing scientific about that. But aren't we at the point in Greek where any learning device we can come up with is helpful? And that can be a principle for you here. Rule 4. The stem vowel of me verbs can lengthen, shorten, or drop out, as I noted just a moment ago. And in the singular, that omicron lengthens to omega in each place, but here we can see it's back to omicron, omicron, omicron. So just a principle, but let's review our endings again. Cementi insi, misi mentasi, misi menteasi. And we can keep in mind, as we saw on the previous slide, same ending here and here, same ending first plural, second plural. It's just in the first singular, third singular, and third plural that we have differences. But this is easy. It's me verbs. That's what we're exactly thinking about. We can differentiate the third singular from the third plural, and the third plural has more letters, and we keep in mind that in the singular, that omicron lengthens to omega. That does not happen in the plural. See how these rules are coming together? In a sense, that first slide, when we were looking just at rule 1, I was already talking about these other rules. It's difficult to talk about just one because we're seeing the word in full. And I'm not concerned so much that you memorize and differentiate. Okay, it was rule 1 that we thought about reduplication. It was rule 2 where we thought about just the ending bumping right up to the stem and so forth. You don't have to memorize the rules necessarily, though they will help you as principles to differentiate. What you need to do is be able to recognize the differences between didwmi in the present, in the imperfect, in the future, and so forth. And we'll look at those ideas in just a couple of moments. Almost there now. Rule 5. These rules, again, you can start with any one of them to identify athematic or me verbs. And I noted on that first slide that these sort of blend together. Well, here we are at Rule 5, and what we are thinking about especially is the aorist tense form. And what we have is a ka replacing a saw. We're used to the aorist having saw as our active tense formative, but here ka, the problem is ka is normally the perfect. Remember, that's the tense formative for the perfect active indicative. We use ka. So how are we going to differentiate these two? Well, we have a couple of cues. First, the perfect, and here we have, these are both thematic, so these are normal. It's the me verb that's athematic that we're thinking about here today. But the thematic use a connecting vowel, so this is what we know already, these two columns. And you can see saw and ka. So how are we going to differentiate, though, this athematic category here from the perfect over here, since the aorist uses ka here? Well, you can see the principle obvious from the very beginning of the word. The perfect always begins with reduplication. The aorist in the indicative begins with augment. There's clearly a difference between the two. So though both have ka at the end, it's the beginning of the word that can help us to differentiate the aorist from the perfect, and that will always be true. The perfect will reduplicate and the aorist. So a verb like didwmi, we'll see soon, in the perfect is dedoka as opposed to edoka. So that will differentiate the aorist from the perfect. The perfect, reduplication. The aorist, just the augment. So here across the various stems, and again, what we're interested in is not you necessarily memorizing rules 1 through 5. That can be helpful, but what we must know is the difference between these tense stems. We must differentiate between present, imperfect, future, aorist, and perfect. And the problem for some students is some of these look a bit alike, but focus on the distinguishing factors. So again, we have a reduplication in the present and in the imperfect, but what differentiates the two? Here in the imperfect, we have the augment. Some students remember and because they remember, sometimes that leads to confusion if it's not a clear differentiation of ideas, but the imperfect and aorist both have an augment. Well, how can we differentiate the two? Well, the aorist has a ka and not a saw. That we can remember from that idea, and we can often remember as well from the actual stem. And in some cases, we're going to have this lengthening to omega here in the aorist that is not happening in the imperfect. The future has the lengthening also, like the present does, the lengthening of the stem vowel, and then that future tense formative. The future gives us the opportunity to remember that in the present we have different endings in the first singular, third plural, but in the future we follow our pattern exactly. No ending is used, cementi-nsi. But in, again, the present here, we have the lengthening in the present, the present singular. Me verbs, that stem vowel lengthens, but not in the plural. And so here we just have the stem vowel with ausin. And that will, again, differentiate from the imperfect as well. We have the differentiation between the perfect and the present in that the perfect, we continue to have our tense formative kappa alpha, and we have the reduplication with epsilon as opposed to a reduplication with iota in the present. You may want to go back and look at this slide and again at the beginning of the screencast, and I want to state it one more time. I'm not interested that you memorize these rules. I want you to be familiar with them, but we must come to the point where we can differentiate each of these tense stems, because we need to know that a present is not a future, that an imperfect is not a present. We need to know the difference between an aorist and a perfect. We need to continue to distinguish the aorist from the imperfect. It's knowing points of commonality and also distinction, because this is where exegesis happens. These rules just help you to get there, and these principles can help you along the way. And these 5 rules really just begin with the beginning of a word, and what's going to happen at the beginning, what's going to happen in the middle with the stem, and then the blout of a vowel or not, the endings being putting right on the end, and so forth. A few vocab words, and again, we're needing to distinguish between the noun stem and verbal root, ethnos, nations, loipos, remaining behind, someone's loitering, they're remaining behind. Piptoe is an important word. See pages 396 and also 459. The obvious distinction between the root and the stem, or the stem of the present anyway, and you can look at the explanation there for piptoe from the root pet and how that epsilon drops off, and we have an inclusion of the reduplication here. Even though we're not in a me verb, there's a characteristic of a me verb there in the reduplication. So see those pages, and Mounce can fill you in a bit further. My mnemonic is tiptoe, piptoe. If I tiptoe, I might fall. Continue on in your Greek text and pressing on with this vocab. As you work through me verbs, try to assimilate these new principles into what you already know and get right to your exercises this week.